Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Olivia Stevens with EDF Action, the advocacy partner of Environmental Defense Fund, and I am so excited for the conversation that we have lined up this evening. I am sure I'm not alone in recognizing how extreme the weather this summer has already been. Just today, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released a climate report finding that 2024 is set to be another record-breaking year for high temperatures and billion-dollar disasters, with $4 billion disasters in July alone. Tonight, we will dive into what solutions communities and governments are pursuing to mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So we have several really exciting speakers joining us this evening. From our EDF and EDF Action team, we have Sarah Henshaw, the legislative analyst for coastal and flood resilience. Sarah joined EDF 2 years ago as a legislative analyst working with their federal affairs and climate resilient coasts and watersheds teams. She is charged with EDF's lobbying work on coastal resilience and flood issues, pushing legislation in Congress and working to increase resilience efforts and funding in federal agencies like FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers. She is also the coordinator of the Federal Policy Committee at the Restore the Mississippi River Delta Coalition, advocating for policies that will help restore coastal Louisiana. She is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and has her undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We also, from our EDF Action family, have Michelle Lovejoy, the Senior Manager of Climate Resilient Coasts and Watersheds. Michelle works at the nexus of flood mitigation and equitable engagement principles within the framework of watershed approaches in Southeast geographies. She joined EDF in 2021 and centers her work on co-designing policy solutions with communities that align with the climate science and produce economic co-benefits, which bolster adaptability to encroaching climate challenges. Prior to joining EDF, she worked for over 15 years in the North Carolina agriculture community and holds a master's degree in environmental and engineering geosciences from Radford University and undergraduate degrees in anthropology, geology, and mathematics from Appalachian State. So welcome our EDF family. We also have a few exciting guests with us. Chuck Chadovitz is Vice President for Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. For more than 25 years, he has specialized in environment and energy issues, working with companies on strategies to improve their bottom line and competitive positioning. At the Chamber, Chuck is launching a new environment and sustainability capability to foster unique partnerships among the private sector, government, and civil society organizations. He works with members to support company leadership on sustainability, building the business case and in the enabling conditions. I lost my place. Through common sense public policy and the actions of member companies. Welcome, Chuck. We also have Tyler Taba with the Waterfront Alliance and the Rise to Resilience Coalition. Tyler joined Waterfront Alliance in January 2022 as the Senior Manager for Climate Policy and was quickly promoted to Director of Resilience. He is charged with developing climate change policy and strategy, leading the coordination and convening of the Rise to Resilience Coalition, and identifying changes and trends in climate change that affect and dictate new strategy. Welcome, Tyler. And finally, we have I missed Michelle. Oh, wait, no, I went through Michelle. We have Charles Sutcliffe with the National Wildlife Federation. Charles joined the National Wildlife Federation as their senior advisor for resilience in 2024 after spending more than a decade in the Louisiana governor's office. While in the governor's office, Charles worked on policy in support of the CPRA and the coastal program through the 2012, 2017, and 2023 master plans and was the lead staff for the Governor's Advisory Commission. In 2020, Charles was on the governor's small team running the Climate Initiatives Task Force and helping to develop the 2022 Climate Action Plan. In 2020, he also became the state's first Chief Resilience Officer, first working to broaden the state's approach to managing the implications of the coastal crisis, and then later being appointed to the roles statewide and across multiple environmental hazards. Charles is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and attended college at LSU and has a master's degree from New York University. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It's an impressive group, and so excited to get diving into these questions. Just wanted to add a quick reminder for those of you who are tuning in. If you have questions, please add them to the comments section from wherever you are viewing this conversation, and we will address them when we get to the Q&A at the end of our conversation today. So gonna dive into the questions here. The first question I have is for everyone in the group to answer, so maybe we can do a little bit of a round robin. I am sure everyone here is aware of the rise in extreme weather as it has all affected us in many unique ways, from storms and flooding to extreme heat. So I want to ask, what does climate resilience mean to you, and why is it important right now? So I will pass it to whoever wants to take a stab at that first question.
I'm happy to go first. Yes, as we all know, 2023 was the hottest year on record, and 2024 is shaping up to take that record on. Along with the heat, we've seen devastating wildfires and hurricanes, floods, and storms. Disasters fueled by the climate crisis are already worse than scientists originally predicted. And that's not to mention the weather events that don't necessarily qualify as disasters that are happening more and more frequently and threatening human health, property, and critical infrastructure like military installations. So for me, from a federal government perspective, focusing on legislative and regulatory fixes, resilience means transitioning our mindset on climate-fueled disasters from reactive to proactive. I think historically we have dealt with major climate disasters by just throwing out federal disaster declarations and then using that money to try to repair the damage done. But what we haven't really done a good job of is planning and preparing in advance for climate impacts through things like resilience planning, making infrastructure more resilient, restoring habitats like wetlands that act as natural barriers, moving people out of vulnerable areas, and then providing more resources for socially vulnerable and historically marginalized communities that are often most affected by events like this. So I think, we really need to start working towards a future where the federal government can provide structure, resources, and direction for state and local governments that allow them to be better prepared for more extreme weather. And I think we need something that allows us to both work bottom up and top down in order to find some solutions that work for the needs of individual communities. I anticipate hearing from others during this event about how there's sometimes a disconnect between what communities need and what's being provided at the federal level. So yeah, since I think I work more in the top-down space, I think a good start is to have a clear, consolidated strategy for resilience to climate-related weather impacts at the federal level. As of right now, the federal government's approach to disaster preparedness is really siloed. It takes place in several agencies, and those efforts are often duplicative of each other or they're in conflict with each other. There are state efforts to create resilient strategies, and I know Charles and others will probably talk about that later, but there's still that lack of a federal strategy, and that just results in a really piecemeal effort across the board. So yeah, I'll stop there, but wanted to thank everyone for being here and being willing to learn more about how we can better prepare for climate change.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I will go ahead and pass it to Michelle, who I believe is in the midst of a hurricane at the moment. So Michelle, why is resilience important to you?
Well, thank you for giving me some time. And yes, if I were to suddenly disappear from the podcast, this is why. It's because I can see the hurricane crossing our state out my window at my office right now. Resilience is a really big word that means different things to different people. I think of it as bouncing forward after you experience a climate event like Hurricane Debbie that's hitting my state right now. How will I make adjustments so that I lessen the impacts to my family from future storms? But the bigger question for me and why I do this work is, can we envision a world where we all bounce forward together, even when we don't understand all the details of what we may face in our lives as the climate changes? Effective government policies that are co-designed with community input is one really good place to start. So more of that bottom-up approach, which is where I work. I'll speak today from the perspective of flooding and the impacts from that. But I want you, when you hear me talk, to think of whatever climate threat is on your heart and mind of concern that you're facing, because the underlying process solutions are all the same regardless of the climate threat. Curious though, Chuck, what you think about resilience.
No, thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And first, thanks to the EDF team and all of you for including the Chamber in this important discussion. When I think about what resilience is, I think about the practical implication on communities and on our businesses. If the road goes out and employees cannot get to work and customers aren't able to get to the location to buy products and services, there's a real impact on the communities and their economies and the businesses who operate there. And there's a study that says something on the order of 65% of small businesses don't have contingency plans. So they're not planning ahead and thinking about how to be more resilient and to respond back more quickly. So more tools and resources are needed at all levels of government so that communities and companies can plan ahead of the next crisis. Charles?
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, so, I'm coming at this from Louisiana. We don't have a hurricane right now, thankfully, but we do have the third highest cost of natural disasters of anybody in the country. And we're also losing land to the Gulf of Mexico faster than anywhere else in the country. So we have a tremendous amount of historic risk, and it's getting worse in the future. And what we've seen and what we know, if you've been through any disaster, is that these things really ripple and compound and cascade through society. And so it's really too much for any one agency or any one organization to kind of tackle all by themselves. And so when I'm thinking about resilience, I'm thinking about expanding the conversation. Yes, you need to have better infrastructure. Yes, you need to be doing disaster response, but you also need to be thinking about what the economic implications are, what the social implications are, what happens to culture if you're hit by disasters over and over again. And so we're really looking for a way to include everybody in this kind of process and conversation and progress. So we want to also be able to have a way to do. I think when we're resilient, we're also tackling new things as they come up. And so there are certain risks and hazards that are out there that don't really have a home. They don't have anybody who's kind of really focused on them. So in Louisiana, we were trying to create a space to tackle those things as well. And it's important because, I think, yes, we need to be doing everything we can on greenhouse gas emissions. Completely support that. But the impacts from climate change are here today and are going to stay with us, even if we're wildly successful on reducing emissions. And so these things have a social cost to us. They have an economic cost. They also have an opportunity cost. In Louisiana, sometimes we go whole years where everybody is focused on disaster recovery, and you don't have time to be building towards a better future because you're trying to come back from the last thing. And so we've got to get to a point where we can be pursuing our own agendas and not just recovering all the time. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. And I think we have Tyler. Tyler, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And thanks again, echoing everybody at EDF team for putting this together. It's great to be here. I am representing here in the New York and New Jersey Harbor region. I'm based in New York City, and Waterfront Alliance is a bi-state organization. So that's kind of the lens that I'll be bringing. And yeah, I agree with a lot of what everybody has said so far about why climate resiliency is important. And I guess, at the most basic level, resiliency means that we're prepared for what's to come, and we're prepared and able to withstand what's to come, and particularly able to withstand better than last time. And so, that's at least, I think, what it means in practice and in definition. But personally, why resiliency is important to me, especially as a younger person coming into this field, is that it offers us, I think, an opportunity to think really uniquely and creatively and differently about our future. And, here in the Harbor region, I think there's a lot of creativity and opportunity ahead of us. And it's clear that the business as usual way of designing infrastructure and building and the way that our built environment exists is not working. And so resiliency is not continuing to redo all of those things, but it's actually to say, yes, we want to be safe from extreme weather, but how can we also address some of those economic and social outcomes that Charles was just talking about? We're an organization that's also focused on public access to the waterfront and recreation and youth-based education. And so how do we live with water? How do we become, we're a waterfront city. New York City is 520 linear miles of coastline. And so being resilient isn't just walling ourselves off. It's thinking about how we have upward mobility and social mobility and use the climate as a way to kind of make all of that happen and rewrite some of the structural wrongs that have gotten us here. And so I know that might be a little bit abstract and idealistic, but I'm a young person. I'm a climate optimist, and I have to be, because this is my future. And so I think, we have an opportunity really ahead of us to make a climate resilient and healthy future through this work.
Thank you, Tyler, and thanks everyone for answering that question. Really helps kind of, give us an overview of, the perspectives that you're all coming from. So I want to maybe stick with Tyler for a second, and maybe Michelle, you can jump in here as well. What are communities doing to prepare for more extreme weather? And are they equally vulnerable to the threats posed by extreme weather?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I think Sarah was the one who brought up the fact that we're often reactive and not proactive at the government level. But at the community level, in my experience, there are so many wonderful community leaders and community plans that local residents and neighborhoods are putting together to be resilient and be healthy in the face of climate change. And I can speak to experiences directly after Hurricane Sandy. There was so much work that happened on the ground where communities put local plans and visions together for what they see their future looking like. And I think what's been tough is that sometimes, or often, the community leadership is far ahead of political will, and so you have a lot of these plans that are in place and ideas that come out of disasters, but they're sometimes stuck on a shelf, or there's not opportunity to fund those programs and plans. And so what communities are doing, I think they're understanding the risks, right? That's the lived experience of the people who are there. If you want to know exactly where it floods or where it's hot in a certain neighborhood or a school, it's at the community level that you get access to that information. And so communities know what's happening and should be the first place that I think we go when we have historic levels of federal funding or state funding. And to your second question about is risk the same everywhere, I'd say, unfortunately, it's not. And even if the sea level rise projection or the rain projection or the temperature projection is the same blanket for the city of New York, for example, there are people who are well equipped and people who are less equipped to respond to that. And again, speaking locally here, there's a really ugly legacy of redlining and urban planning, racist urban planning, that has put a lot of communities in harm's way disproportionately. And so we might all be facing the same risks, but not everybody has the same opportunity to respond to those risks or have the same outcomes coming out of those risks. And so I think that's a really important note to think about as we talk about resiliency and statewide and federal planning. And so I'm happy to toss it over to Michelle.
Yeah, I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on the risk side and the vulnerability side by sharing a personal story about Matthew, Michael, and Florence. We had 3 hurricanes hit the Southeast in 2016 and 18 that changed the trajectory of my life and of all of our communities. I was able to visit a coastal county 6 months after Hurricane Florence, and my farmer friend was taking all of us on a tour, and he said, at night we used to see the lights of our neighbors' houses, and now the land is dark. Everyone left. We don't know where they went, and we don't know when they're coming back, if at all. And this really shook me. It made me realize that this was our Katrina moment, because it had been almost 20 years since our state had experienced hurricane impacts at this magnitude, and recovery was slow and very painful. Many of the friends I met in the community recovery spaces waited for over a year with literal tarps on their roofs. Some of them even gave up on trying to navigate the FEMA recovery process. Another quick example, backing out to the town level, is what we started calling the recovery tale of 2 towns. They were both small rural towns, like population of a couple thousand or less, along a major river in our state, that during Florence, they experienced a 2-stage flood event. So the first flooding was the water coming in from the sea, the storm surge. And then a week later, all the drainage coming out of the mountains made the river flood a second time. One town literally had a volunteer town manager that had access to earth moving equipment. And 48 hours before the storm, they started to shore up things down on Main Street, not knowing that they actually needed government permits to do that kind of work in and around floodplains. The other town knew about the permitting process, and so they didn't do anything. They were hands off because they knew legally they really weren't supposed to do anything. The town that followed those traditional rules was wiped out. It's not a town anymore. The other town that took some action on their own with the help of their neighbors avoided some of the worst of the flooding. And at least in the Southeast, we need to start to prepare for all kinds of storm events that will happen more frequently and more intensely with each passing year. Recovery advocates now talk about how hurricane season is year round, then they never stop preparing for the next storm. So really, without that coordinated government approach, these lessons learned from one major storm event, they get lost from one generation to the next. And we see ourselves repeating the same mistakes, and our most vulnerable pay the highest price, and that we just cannot continue to operate and do business that way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Tyler. Chuck, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah. Happy to add 2 quick points. Just wanted to highlight kind of a case study. The Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, which is a coalition of 106 mayors along the Mississippi River, they determined that nature-based solutions would provide more long-term protection against flooding and provide other benefits than traditional infrastructure. And so the coalition, MRCTI, is collaborating with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Ducks Unlimited in several communities, I think it's 7 or 8, along the river to pilot installing nature-based measures that will both build resilience to and provide flood protection, at the same time having dual benefits of sequestering carbon around those communities. So, I think there are some positive stories to tell about communities that are doing innovative things. And then the other thing to mention, because both Tyler and Michelle kind of highlighted some of the challenges of the most vulnerable communities, there is a new federal program, and we may talk about this later, to address the most at-risk, most vulnerable communities, the Community Disaster Resilience Zone Act. I think most, if not all, of the groups on this call, and I'm sure many in the audience, supported the bill. It establishes a program at FEMA to use a risk approach to identify the most at-risk, most vulnerable communities, and then to allow federal programs to use that to help direct funding. Right now, there isn't specific funding attached to the program. There is an increased federal share attached to FEMA, to BRIC grants through FEMA, but more needs to be done to provide direct incentives to those communities to implement resilient measures.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks everybody for answering that question. I want to pivot and talk to Charles for a second here and ask about how state and local governments are currently aiding in this process, and what's working and what isn't.
Well, sure. So thanks. I again, coming from Louisiana, we have done a lot of large scale resilience work over the years. Next year in August, unbelievably, will be the 20th anniversary of Katrina, which really kind of kicked off our coastal. It's our big wake up call, frankly, in Louisiana. Since then, just on the coastal side, we've developed, cutting edge models, really extensive stakeholder engagement processes. We've really done a lot of coalition building and political work to kind of get us to a point where we're building $1 billion a year worth of projects. So that's the kind of scale that I think a lot of people want to be at, and we are very, very proudly there. So one, I would say it is possible to make real progress against these really big, seemingly impossible challenges. And so we've done it in 20 years. We've not solved it, but I think that's give reason for optimism, for Tyler there and the rest of us. I think too, so that what the state can do, the state was able to step in and put some resources towards regional modeling, regional, project development, and really driving implementation through that. So that was on the one big piece. I think the other thing that we've done is we've said that we don't want to just kind of like others have said is just kind of respond to each disaster as it comes. So we had a giant hurricane. So we said, oh no, we've got to get a hurricane program together. And then we had a giant statewide flood. And then we got to get a statewide flood program together. So we're trying to, through the creation of a chief resilience officer position and a network of resilience officers in every department, trying to have that connective tissue, have those people talking to one another, being able to think about problems as they emerge before they're here, kind of what does that long-term look like. So we've been doing that, as a state. This is only our second year kind of having that statewide multi-hazard approach. So I think we have, a long way to go before we're at the coastal program level. We're not spending $1 billion a year on that yet, but, one day. And I think too, just to bring it back to the feds for a second, that's we were talking about earlier, I do think it's amazing to have so many different resilience funding opportunities out there right now, from NOAA, EPA, FEMA, even people like DOT that might not always be thinking of themselves as resilience funders, and energy. Clearly we need all these investments, but at the same time, I think there's still room for a more generalized approach. I would love I might not need $2 million for marine debris removal from NOAA this year, but I might really need an extreme heat plan. And so if there was a way to kind of just do some of that capacity building. So state, here's just and I don't know if it's a block grant, but some way to kind of just encourage that kind of the connective tissue funding, the capacity funding, the ability for states to kind of follow their own path. I think that would be really good alongside those big resilience investments. And if you're going to send, millions through EPA, NOAA, and all the other places at the same time, you probably do want somebody in there coordinating and making sure there's like a vision behind that, and they're actually talking to one another as they implement it. So I think that's a little bit of room for improvement, but I think we're getting there, and there's some legislation that I know y'all want to bring up that could get us closer to that.
Yes, absolutely. We will be getting to that. Do anybody else want to comment on that question about how state and local governments are aiding in this process?
I've got some comments to offer.
Sure.
One of the places we looked to was Louisiana after those hurricanes, as well as Iowa, Minnesota, Texas, and some of the other states that have done a little bit of work in advance of what North Carolina was doing. So we're still in the experimental stages of what coordination can really look like, and it's messy in the beginning. And when it floods in your backyard or your town, you see it, you feel it, and you want that levee or that preventative measure installed in your backyard or your town so that you never have to have that experience again. But really, when it comes to water management, you need to look further upstream, where you may be able to install practices, like was mentioned earlier, that mimic nature and cost way less over time to maintain. So how do you create a process where towns work with their upstream neighbors to identify those proactive measures for flood mitigation? And how can you demonstrate to town leaders that they need to spend their funds outside of their jurisdiction in partnership with other towns? And so EDF took some of these lessons learned from other towns, encouraged some other stakeholders to look at it. And we brought in this concept of the watershed approach, and the state's rolling out an online decision support tool and planning process that will allow communities to input different solution options and allow them to weigh out the pros and cons, understand the trade-offs from economic to cultural, and especially important, avoid making it worse for their downstream neighbors. Once this tool is in place later this year, we can start to work towards regional approaches so that each town is not competing against each other for resources, but we're using tax funds to make the right investments in the right places geographically and in the right order. And this will take more than a tool, and that's the part we're still thinking through. Part of it is changing our mindset and realizing by meeting the needs of my neighbors upstream, I'm also meeting my needs. And more of my needs can be addressed at a future time. It's not easy, but we are taking the steps towards this kind of outcome, and you have to start somewhere. And coordination is this key from the bottom up and the top down. And then the state's hopes and goals is once we have an online decision support tool like this in place, we can start to tap things like the funds that were released through the Storm Act into FEMA, which is a new type of state revolving loan program that allows a state to install proactive measures before the next storm happens. So we're really excited about the prospect, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there for sure.
Thanks, Michelle. And on a kind of similar note, do you want to talk a little bit about what tools exist to help entities access federal resources or to help them better understand their climate vulnerabilities?
Sure. I'll take a little bit of time to highlight two tools that EDF's been involved in, because there's lots of tools out there and it's hard to know where to start. But these I've worked with some communities with, and they're pretty effective. One is an online tracker for the Inflation Reduction Act that EDF created in partnership with Columbia Law School. So you can track the status of different funding pots when they're accepting applications, making awards, what's the eligibility requirements, and what they're tweaking along the way as they change the program to address specific needs. The Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of resources on the energy side, which is not my area of expertise, but a lot of tax credits that got built in for individuals and home units. And so I encourage you to check it out. And we can even see a way to get you a link to that tool. The second one is the Climate Vulnerability Index, and this one is really slick. EDF created it in partnership with Texas A&M University and Dark Horse Analytics. And it shows you any town's exposure and sensitivity to a variety of climate impacts across the continental United States. But more importantly, it incorporates future climate change projections in addition to identifying vulnerability of communities experiencing cumulative impacts, so more than one threat. And this is what makes it different from any other tool that I've seen that's out there. As you dig deeper into it, you'll see that it has resources to help with grant writing by providing options to create custom reports. So one of the tool points you to where to find resources, and the other tool helps you to request the resources. I personally, before I joined EDF, managed a state nonprofit for 10 years, and I would have done anything to have this kind of resource at my fingertips. So please take a little time to check it out later on in the week.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll second those tools. Really, really cool. And particularly the Climate Vulnerability Index for individuals, trying to assess where they kind of fall in the range of the vulnerabilities that they're facing. And we'll make sure that folks have access to those links once we wrap up here. So I want to move back to maybe Charles and ask, what are chief resilience officers? We know you previously held that role, and how can they play a role in building resilience across states and across the country?
So now I can talk. So chief resilience officers, they have different roles, I think, what kind of hazards a state or a community is really dealing with the most. And it depends a little bit on kind of what governance structures you already have in place as a state, I think. So I think they're all a little bit different from place to place, but what they kind of are, I think, when they're most effective, they're really a coordinator, they're an orchestrator, they try to instigate kind of this resilience thinking and acting across and within government, and so at all levels. So when we were doing it in Louisiana, we were trying to reach across every department in the state government, but we also knew that so many parishes we're trying to access these federal funds. We're trying to do planning efforts. We're trying to get their project built. So we wanted to support them, and then we also found that there was just this a larger group of stakeholders that wanted to be engaged. Like Tyler and Michelle were talking about earlier, like that they know about their community, they know what they're facing, they want to talk to it, but they didn't have any act. Like, who do I complain to, or who do I advocate to, or who do I, try to get money from? And so the CRO kind of creates this channel for communities also, just to kind of reach kind of the highest levels of government, I think. So there's some processes and tools that a lot of us do, like vulnerability assessments and things like that were kind of been brought up. And I think that's really good. But I think it really was more about, for us, beyond just process, it was really about leading a cultural shift, I think, across state agencies, across government. You're really just asking the question, what if next summer is as bad as this one? What if this isn't a one-off event? Like, how are we looking forward as a group? How are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do? So I think, a lot of folks don't have that capacity. They don't have the time in their day. They don't have the ability to look past the next budget cycle, and their budget's probably going down and not going up. So to have somebody able to kind of go in there and work and kind of be that instigator again with them is really good. So then finally, I think we found it successful. I did this work under an executive order for a year, and then with the help of EDF, actually we got a state law in place, and we got it elevated from. It just really went much further once it was a appointee with the state law behind you. All of a sudden, now you're able to talk to those federal agencies directly. You're able to talk to those cabinet officials directly. So to be high enough up to kind of be able to do that coordinating and not just kind of have your email at the bottom of the email pile is really important too, I think. So there's some structure to it. But it's really a coordinating position, I think.
Thanks, Charles. Do others want to weigh in? Maybe Tyler?
Yeah, that was really well said, Charles. And actually, some of the success that came out of that work and that you led in Louisiana has really been the impetus behind some efforts, some advocacy efforts that we have here in New York around actually creating a statewide resilience officer at the executive level through legislation. And we're actually working with EDF on that with the Climate Resilient Coast and Watershed team in the New York and New Jersey region. And we really saw the success in other states that have that kind of coordinator. And in New York, for example, we have a lot of different agencies that have some level of resiliency work within their portfolio. It's in the transportation team, it's in the parks team, it's in the Department of State, within Homeland Security. It's definitely in the Department of Environmental Conservation. But how often are those agencies talking to each other? And so having somebody really at that convening role at the executive level that can span across all the different agencies and bring people together, I think it's really, really important. And so just want to say, kudos to the work that you did in Louisiana, because that really helped us understand how it can work effectively and how we can bring that model from there up here and have a statewide plan and a chief resiliency officer.
Great, cool.
Absolutely. Others?
To jump in here, and I'll just real quickly, that really important that we elevate the issue of resilience. The global discussions on climate have really focused, and rightly so, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But until recently, adaptation and resilience have not been on equal par, and as a consequence, countries have not elevated the issue to the same level as perhaps mitigation efforts are. And so really important that executive position does make sure that we focus on that as a state or as a country.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chuck, and thanks everybody for answering that question. I want to stick with you, Chuck, actually, and ask, from a business or an economic development perspective, how can climate resilience help spur economic growth or save money?
No, really great question, and I appreciate the opportunity. So the Chamber, and along with all of you, have long supported building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure as among our top priorities. It's really important to the business community in reducing risks. And accordingly, we work to build the business case to help drive both public and private investments in pre-disaster mitigation and planning, both domestically and around the world. And so the Chamber, along with our foundation and Allstate, recently released a report where we modeled the economic impact of investing ahead of the next crisis in 25 communities of various sizes with various natural disaster types across our nation. The bottom line is that for every dollar invested in resilience and pre-disaster mitigation, communities receive $13 in economic savings and reduced losses and cleanup costs. And just one example, and New Orleans was also one of the communities, and I don't have that at my fingertips, but I'll definitely send that to you, Charles, and the group. But in Miami, for a $10.8 billion investment in resilience for a Category 4 hurricane that would impact Miami, would prevent losses of about 184,000 jobs and save $26 billion in production and $17 billion in income. And the idea is that just helps the economy recover more quickly, and that allows communities to get back on their feet and respond to disasters in a more effective way.
Others want to jump in here?
Well, I was a part of an economic study way back in the day, so these numbers are a little bit old, but we looked at the same kind of thing that Chuck's talking about in New Orleans. And, the hurricane protection system that they have around the city is state of the art, $14.5 billion, but a single storm, can cause $175 billion. So I think that's, even though these numbers seem really big, I think the multiplier effect of doing it on the front end is just absolutely worth it. And it's a tough case to make to Congress, I know, but so I appreciate Chuck's advocacy there and Sarah and all the other work, but it's for real. We saw something similar in a less famous area of our coast where a 9-foot storm surge flooded 11,000 people, and the next time they got a 9-foot storm surge, because they made these local and state driven investments, they flooded 11 people. And that is just a huge deal for the economy, for the community, for everything. And it's you've got to make that investment.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you, Chuck. Really, really important piece of the puzzle there. So I have one more question for the group here before we move on to our action items and our Q&A. Do we need a national resilience strategy? And what might that look like? Are there any legislative proposals to build resilience? I'll pass it to Sarah first.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. The lights are turning off in the office here, so I hope you guys can still see me. But to answer your question, yes, I do think we need a national resilience strategy. We've heard from panelists about the need for, to make resilience a priority, and that there are already some really great efforts going on at the local and state level and in the private sector. But I think they could really use some coordination and just a larger, longer term vision. I think the federal policy landscape has been fairly active in the resilience space during the Biden administration. And I think Charles was talking about this a little bit earlier, but there have been some major wins like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that have brought some huge infusions of funding into the resilience space. And various federal agencies have had some regulatory wins, and the White House has worked across agencies to develop a resilience framework and specific agency resilience plans. So, there's been some one-time investments and successes, but what we really need to do is institutionalize resilience within the federal government and make this, a national priority via legislation that would be signed into law. So we've been working on a bill. It's called the National Coordination on Adaptation and Resilience for Security Act. We use the acronym NCARS, so I'm going to say that instead of using the long title. But it's a bipartisan and a bicameral bill. And among other things, it would require the federal government to create a national adaptation and resilience strategy. So the bill would, consolidate the federal government's disaster planning efforts and work towards that proactive approach that I was kind of talking about earlier. So the bill was introduced in Congress in November of last year, and it was introduced by Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, and then Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska in the Senate, and then Rep. Scott Peters from California, and Rep. Maria Salazar in the House, and she's from Florida. In both chambers, the bill has been introduced, been referred to the committees of jurisdiction, and to just kind of waiting uptake by those committees for review and passage so that they can be voted on in the full Senate and the full House. So just quickly, I know we're running a little bit low on time, but to go into more details about the bill, NCARS has 4 major pillars. The first, it would require the president to appoint a chief resilience officer in the White House. And they would be charged with improving the coordination of all the different federal resilience initiatives that are going on. Second, it would establish a partners council on adaptation and resilience. And that would essentially be an interagency working group that's made up of representatives from state, local, and tribal governments, non-governmental organizations, and also the private sector. So I think this really ties into what Tyler was saying earlier about, raising up community voices and actually finding a platform for their expertise and ideas. So this group would help to take stock of, some of the barriers they're dealing with, and help the CRO identify solutions to address them. Third, it would require, the CRO and then this partners council to work together to create this national resilience strategy. And that would be updated every 3 years. The bill is really specific about what should be included in the strategy. And I'm happy to answer more on that later, but just a few things, it would talk about how best we can utilize federal funding, how best the federal government can support non-federal partners like state and local governments, how we can improve collaboration between all these levels of government, how we can better measure resilience, how can we create financial incentives for resilience efforts, and then, how can we work to address historical inequities in this space, among many other things. And then lastly, NCARS would require the establishment of an adaptation and resilience clearinghouse. And that would essentially be like a one-stop shop website for resilience data and information that is produced and published by the federal government. I think there's a lot of confusion from, state and local folks about like, where do I go to find out, how I can apply to this program? So yeah, it would just, allow other levels of government to better understand their climate vulnerabilities and how they can access federal resources. So yeah, I think the hope is that NCARS will minimize redundancies among federal agencies, like I was kind of talking about earlier, and identify ways that we can, the federal government can better support states and communities, and then incorporate those suggestions into a national resilience strategy. So the bill currently has support of both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate across many different geographies. And we're currently just working to build up that co-sponsor list a little bit. So yeah, I'll stop rambling, but I don't know if Chuck wants to add anything or anyone else.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add 2 points. One is that it couldn't be more important that the National Resilience Strategy and the other elements of the bill are institutionalized in law. That we have a durable resilience policy that includes a National Resilience Strategy is important from a good public policy standpoint. So that's definitely issue number one. And then number two is that really important that we consider the issue of prioritization. We held a roundtable. Many of the folks that were here, on the panel were there, and one of the big things, the big takeaways from that discussion was that both local and state governments, as well as federal partners, were saying how important it is that the prioritization of actions are included in law, in the strategy. And so just want to underscore those 2 things, but happy to, let's go to questions from the audience, Olivia.
Thanks, Chuck. And we are going to actually move quickly to our action ask, which is around NCARS, but I am not done with the panelists yet. We will come back to you for the Q&A once we do that. So I just want to, give a huge thank you to the panelists. Like I said, we'll come back to you in a second, but I'm going to hand things over to Sarah to talk a little bit about what you can do to support NCARS and efforts at the federal level to address and respond to extreme weather and the climate risks that we've been discussing. So I'll pass it back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. And thanks everyone for joining us again. And thanks to all of our panelists for y'all's time and for being willing to share your experiences with us. Looking forward to diving into some of the questions we have from the audience, but wanted to share a way that y'all can help support some of the work we've been doing around NCARS. As we've talked about, the impacts of climate change, like rising temperatures, drought, and intense storms, are threatening communities across the U.S., and we really need to do more to be prepared. And NCARS kind of takes this comprehensive, whole-of-government approach to better understand and address those climate risks, using that valuable input from states and local governments, tribes, NGOs, businesses, and community advocates, like we've heard from this evening. So that's why we would love to ask all for your support in calling on Congress to support a national climate resilience strategy. They're going to provide a link in the comments where you'll be able to send a message directly to your members of Congress and ask them to co-sponsor NCARS. So yeah, look out for that link coming your way. And lastly, you guys can always check the EDF Action Mobilize page for other ways you can take action, and also connect with your local EDF Action organizer. So yeah, trying to be brief. So thanks all, and Olivia, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. We will jump into the Q&A, but let's give folks just a quick second to be able to click that link and send a message to their members of Congress. It's really important to make your voice heard, and this is a super easy method to do so. So click that link, send that message to your member of Congress. If you don't have time to do it here, you can do it right after we wrap things up this evening. Yeah, we'll give folks a second here before we move to the Q&A. All right, hoping folks have had a chance to at least click the link. So we are going to go ahead and move to the audience Q&A portion. And before we get to some of the specific questions, I just want to note that we've seen a couple of comments on the importance of reducing emissions and holding polluters accountable. And, just to say that that is a huge piece of EDF's work and the work of, all of the partners here on this panel. We have many colleagues working on climate mitigation, methane, you name it. But, just want to focus this conversation on climate resilience because, alongside reducing emissions, we also need to make sure that communities and ecosystems can survive and thrive with the climate impacts that we are already seeing and, will likely continue to see. So just want to make that quick note. But with that said, we can move on to the Q&A here. If folks have questions, please add them to the comments from wherever you're viewing this stream. And we will go ahead and get started. So I will go ahead and ask a question here that I'm seeing. What has been the response by farmers and community members to resilience infrastructure efforts?
I can offer some comments. We've had a couple early processes underway supported by our land grant university, NC State, out of the Coastal Dynamics Design Lab. And they went into the communities after the hurricanes before the FEMA relief funds were able to be mobilized and had roundtable discussions of how do you want to envision the future? What can we do before FEMA funds get here? And laid out some really tangible actions and items that they could focus on. And many of those recommendations got bundled into FEMA BRIC applications that were successfully submitted and awarded from the federal government. So that's one piece. The other piece that we are experimenting with in North Carolina, based on some of the approaches that Iowa has taken in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, is looking at where there's marginal farmland where you could temporarily store floodwaters during a storm event and then slowly release them afterwards. Some folks call it water farming. Dispersed flood storage systems is another term. And they operate similar to like an urban stormwater pond where it's capturing the runoff from the parking lot and then slowly over the next couple of days it gets released out of the pond. And so we're really focusing right now on getting some demonstrations in the ground so we can test how that impacts soil, and then having those discussions about then how does that impact crop insurance eligibility and those sort of things. But you have to start with new practices with demonstrations to see how they work. So those are getting installed on our state research farms and state forests. So more to come out of North Carolina. If anybody's interested in following that, we can always follow up with you afterwards.
Thanks, Michelle. Others want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'll just add that we're still considering the Farm Bill. It has significant conservation funding as part of it. It's certainly important to our members, and farmers view that as stewards of the land, that they're going to be important partners in building resilience in those kinds of rural communities. So. A good opportunity to influence that policy.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm seeing another question from Anita. Are there partisan considerations to continued national climate action? Maybe Sarah can jump in on that one.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. And obviously we'll be talking about this from more of a resilience and disaster preparation lens. But yeah, first thing I want to note is that disaster resilience is one of the really truly bipartisan issues in Congress, which really does give us some hope regardless of, what happens in November. The bill has support from state, local, and national groups in all 50 states on both sides of the aisle. I think when we start thinking more about like different partisan messaging and support, first and foremost, some folks in Congress don't like the phrase climate change. So we've had to be really careful with our wording and messaging around bills like in-cars, even though many folks recognize the impacts that we're already feeling on that front. So, for bills like this, we want to try to focus our messaging around, the cost to our communities and the threats to national security if we don't take action. I think we're also working on focusing on localizing our outreach to, each member of Congress that we talk to, their specific district, and the benefits that they can see locally by being more proactive, by taking action on bills like this. I think one more thing I'll note, another issue that we've had a couple offices raise is the idea that this bill like NCARS would increase bureaucracy and create more government essentially. But I think, we would argue that this bill would reduce the amount of government involved in the climate adaptation space by really streamlining the federal government, agencies that are involved and making sure that they're all working together. I think the National Resilience Strategy that I talked about earlier, it would do like a cross-agency analysis of what resilience operations each agency is already taking on, and then would work to identify and rectify those inconsistencies, and making sure there's no overlap or redundancies. So yeah, that would be my argument there. But if anyone else has anything to add.
And just it's good for the taxpayers. I mean, if you look at the economic case, payback of 1 to 13, even if it's below that, payback for the taxpayers for investment in pre-disaster mitigation or resilience is significant.
And also, as you look at these newer practices or nature-based approaches, it's a huge workforce development opportunity as well, because we're already hitting a wall where we don't have enough contractors to know how to install these things. So there's some really interesting, innovative partnerships coming out of some NOAA grants that are looking at workforce development, and specifically in North Carolina, it's how can you partner with the local community college to provide a certification program to those contractors to train them on all the different new innovative nature-based solutions that are coming to the table.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other folks want to weigh in on this, Tyler?
Yeah, I can just say quickly, I think, everybody covered it actually really well. I was just going to add, on not on NCARS, but on other areas where we're working in bipartisan efforts, especially down here, right? I mean, everybody's affected by climate change in some way. And so whether we call it climate change or extreme weather, I think people are seeing what's happening. And we've had a lot of success actually with members on both sides when it comes to Water Resources Development Act language, or even the Army Corps of Engineers, where there are projects and there are opportunities to spur some kind of protection for residents and communities. And so I just think that there's a lot hopefully trending in the right direction. And, Michelle and Chuck talked about workforce, and that's obviously a big part of this. So I think there's a good way that you can message around all of that and really get through to people on what actually matters. And that's making sure people are safe.
Thanks, Tyler. We have one more question that we have time for. We're just about at time here. Has there been an improvement of public perception of federal response systems as a result of more crises and mobilization? Anybody want to attack that one?
I like the idea that those two things would go together. I just don't think that they are in reality. I think people are just consistently just tired, frustrated. They've lost everything. I think that would be the next action alert should be figuring out that disaster, the process to apply for all the different types. We've got to streamline that and figure out ways to make the person who just lost their house, how do they come back? What does that look like? So I would, unfortunately, I don't, in Louisiana, I've not heard people feeling like things are working as planned. Like I know exactly what to do, and this is going to be an easy comeback. That's unfortunately not the case here.
And I would agree with that. We're seeing the same thing in North Carolina, which points directly back to the importance of NCARS. Until you have that streamlined national approach, you can't get to a unified application process where I'm a farmer, I put in an application, it goes to USDA and FEMA because they both have disaster response programs. One's for my fields, one's for my house. Right now, they got to go in two different directions, talk to two different state agencies, even maybe more than two. So a coordinated approach would get us a long way to this issue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle and Tyler, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think that's a great place to end. Just another reminder for folks to click that link in the chat, send a message to your member of Congress about the importance for this, coordinated resilience strategy. NCARS is a really important bill, and so want to see folks, getting their voices out there. So I want to thank all of our panelists one more time. I hope that everybody tuning in learned something. I know I did. Thank you so much for joining us, and for the panelists to taking the time to share the importance of bold climate resilience in the face of our changing climate. I hope to see you all at the next EDF Action event, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
All right, thanks.